I climbed through a culvert to get out of the rain. A widow said, "That man buried more than money on this land." Wren Hartley had $8, a duffel bag with a set of hand tools she'd carried since her last steady job on a drainage infrastructure maintenance crew, and a habit of checking any large culvert she passed for shelter during a storm. A habit that had led her, more than once that year, to exactly the kind of forgotten structure that kept her dry for a few hours at a stretch. She was 21 years old, laid off 7 months earlier when the county contracted its drainage maintenance to a private firm that eliminated her entire position in a single afternoon. She had been moving through farm country ever since, taking whatever short-term work she could find. The contracting decision had come with barely 2 weeks' notice, and Wren had spent the 7 months since relearning, farm town by farm town, that her particular skill with drainage systems and culvert construction mattered a great deal less to most temporary employers than whether she had a fixed address and a reference from the last 6 months. She had grown up around exactly this kind of infrastructure her whole life, her own father having worked county drainage maintenance for nearly 3 decades before her, and she had learned, riding along on his inspection routes as a child, to read a culvert's construction the way another person might read a familiar face, understanding the specific difference between original work and later modification, even from decades-faded concrete. The storm arrived without much warning that particular evening, and Wren climbed into the nearest large culvert she could find, crawling through its dry interior to escape a downpour that had soaked her through within minutes. She emerged on the culvert's far side to find herself on a modest farm property, an elderly woman watching her emergence with an expression that shifted quickly from startled to something considerably more complicated. "You picked an unusual entrance," the woman said, studying Wren with evident curiosity despite the storm still raging around them both. "Come up to the house before you catch your death out here." Wren followed her gratefully, and once settled beside a warm stove with dry clothes and hot coffee, the woman introduced herself as Delphine Rourke, explaining that the farm had belonged to her late husband's family for generations. It was only after Wren mentioned in passing that she'd once worked drainage infrastructure herself that Delphine's expression shifted again into something wary and considering. "You came through that culvert on the property's eastern edge," Delphine said slowly. "That's rather close to where I've been afraid to let anyone dig these past few weeks. There's a man who's recently taken an unusual interest in that exact corner of my land, and I don't believe his interest has anything to do with drainage." "What do you mean?" Wren asked. "My husband had a business partner decades ago named Elias Thorne," Delphine said. "Their partnership ended badly, amid accusations of embezzlement that were never fully resolved before Thorne simply disappeared. I always believed my husband was wrongly suspected in that whole affair, though the accusation followed him, unfairly, for the rest of his life. Thorne showed up at my door 3 weeks ago, asking oddly specific questions about that eastern corner of the property. I have since learned from an old acquaintance that a cold case investigation into the original embezzlement has recently reopened. I believe Thorne buried something on this land decades ago, and he's come back now because he's afraid of exactly what that reopened investigation might eventually uncover." Over the following hour, Delphine told Wren the fuller story of a partnership, dissolved amid suspicion her own husband had carried unfairly to his grave. Elias Thorne and Delphine's husband Marcus had run a small agricultural supply business together for nearly a decade before a substantial sum of company funds went missing, an embezzlement Thorne had quietly blamed on Marcus at the time, though no formal charges had ever been filed before Thorne himself vanished from the county entirely, leaving Marcus to carry the community's lingering suspicion for the remaining 30 years of his own life. The business never recovered properly after the missing funds came to light, Delphine said. "We lost half our customers within the year, most of them simply assuming Marcus had taken the money and quietly disappeared into whatever guilt he apparently felt, when in truth he'd simply stayed, working twice as hard to keep the business afloat while everyone around him assumed the worst. Marcus always insisted Thorne was the one who'd actually taken the money, Delphine said. He never had proof, only his own certainty, and certainty alone rarely convinces a community that's already decided what it believes. He died 3 years ago, still carrying that unfair reputation, still hoping, I think, that the truth would someday surface properly. How did the community treat him all those years without the matter ever being formally resolved? Wren asked. Politely enough, on the surface, Delphine said, but I always sensed the doubt underneath. Whispered conversations that stopped when we entered a room. Business relationships that quietly cooled once the rumor spread. Marcus carried it with more grace than I think I could have managed myself. But I know it wore on him, year after year, never having the chance to properly clear his own name. If Thorne buried evidence of his own guilt here decades ago, and he's come back now worried about a reopened investigation, that might be exactly the proof your husband never had, Wren said. I'd want to understand precisely why Thorne's so interested in that particular corner before either of us decides what to do about it. Wren spent the following days doing the only thing she knew how to do with what little she had. She assessed the culvert and the surrounding drainage system professionally, understanding that her own background gave her a legitimate reason to examine exactly the ground Thorne seemed so concerned about, without raising obvious suspicion about her actual purpose. It was while examining the culvert's original construction records, which Delphine located among her husband's old papers, that Wren noticed a modification to the drainage system's original design, a small access chamber built into the culvert's structure that didn't appear on any of the property's official survey documents, added sometime after the original construction, according to the different concrete mixture visible in that particular section. This chamber isn't original to the culvert, Wren said, examining the concrete's telltale seam carefully, tracing where newer material met the older original structure. Somebody added this after the fact, and did it carefully enough to make it look like part of the original structure to anyone not specifically checking construction records against what's actually built. Could Marcus have added it himself, for some legitimate reason? Delphine asked. The records show the original culvert construction predates your husband's ownership of this land, Wren said. If this chamber was added after that, and doesn't appear in any subsequent survey your husband would have commissioned, I think it's considerably more likely Thorne added it himself, during whatever period he had access to this property as Marcus's business partner. They opened the chamber carefully and found, sealed in a weatherproof container that had somehow survived decades underground, a set of financial ledgers and correspondence that told, in Elias Thorne's own handwriting, the true story of an embezzlement he had orchestrated entirely alone, along with careful notes describing his intention to let suspicion fall on Marcus rather than risk his own exposure. Delphine's hands shook as she paged through the ledger's careful, damning entries, each one a small confession Thorne had apparently never intended anyone else to ever read. He kept records of his own crime, Delphine said, disbelief evident in her voice. I don't understand why a guilty man would document his own guilt this thoroughly, rather than simply destroying any evidence entirely. Some people can't help keeping careful records, whatever they're actually recording, Wren said. I think Thorne may have simply been the kind of meticulous man who tracked everything, including the exact thing that should have stayed untracked. That habit, whatever drove it, is precisely what's about to undo him now. This is exactly what Marcus needed and never had, Delphine said, her voice breaking as she read through decades-old evidence of her husband's innocence. I don't know how to describe what it feels like, holding proof of something I always believed but could never demonstrate. 3 years after he died, still carrying the suspicion this should have cleared decades ago. They contacted the county sheriff's office the following morning, and the reopened investigation's own lead detective, a methodical woman named Priscilla Hart, reviewed the buried ledgers with evident professional satisfaction once she understood their significance. She examined each page carefully, cross-referencing the dates and figures against her own case file, understanding, evidently, exactly how significant this discovery was to an investigation that had sat unresolved for 3 decades. This closes a case that's been technically open for over 30 years, Hart told them. Thorne's own handwriting, describing his own scheme in his own words, leaves no reasonable doubt about what actually happened. I'll need to formally document this evidence, but I don't believe there's any question remaining about your husband's innocence. What happens to Marcus's own reputation now? Delphine asked. I know he can't hear it himself, but I'd like this community to finally understand what actually happened, properly and publicly. I intend to make certain of exactly that, Hart said. A case reopening after 30 years, closed with evidence this conclusive, tends to draw considerable attention. I don't think your husband's name will remain unfairly shadowed for much longer, once this becomes public record. Elias Thorne was located and arrested within the week. The reopened investigation's momentum combined with the buried ledger's unambiguous evidence, leaving him with no viable defense once formal charges were finally filed, 3 decades after his original crime. Hart mentioned, once the arrest was confirmed, that Thorne had apparently spent those 30 years building an entirely new identity 2 states away. His return to the property driven purely by desperation once he'd learned the original case might finally be reopened. He came back for exactly the evidence that ended up convicting him, Hart told Delphine. I don't think there's much irony left to comment on, in a case that resolved itself quite that thoroughly. I don't know how to properly thank you for climbing through that culvert on exactly the right stormy evening, Delphine told Wren, once the investigation's outcome was confirmed. You didn't just find shelter from a storm. You found the proof that finally cleared my husband's name, 3 years too late for him to know it himself, but not too late for the rest of this community to finally understand the truth. I think Marcus's own careful attention to his business records helped as much as anything I did, Wren said. It simply took somebody willing to check a culvert's construction against what its official records actually showed. Wren stayed on at the farm through that winter, and the ones that followed, formally hired by Delphine to properly maintain the property's drainage infrastructure, a position that gave her steady work, and the particular satisfaction of protecting a farm that had finally, after 30 years, cleared the unfair suspicion that had shadowed it. She spent that first year properly restoring the culvert system, removing the hidden chamber's remaining structure, and repairing the modification Thorne had made decades earlier, understanding a particular satisfaction in returning the infrastructure to its honest, original design, rather than leaving it carrying the physical trace of a crime that had shadowed this family for 3 decades. Delphine, in turn, began sharing Marcus's story more openly with the surrounding community, no longer needing to carry the quiet defensiveness she'd maintained for years about a suspicion, finally formally disproven. Marcus would have been glad to know the truth finally surfaced, even if it took a stranger climbing through a culvert to find it, Delphine told Wren one evening, the 2 of them sitting together beside the farmhouse's warm stove. He always said the truth has a way of eventually finding its way to the surface, whatever ground somebody tries to bury it beneath. I think he'd have been glad about more than just his own name being cleared, Wren said. I think he'd have been glad you didn't have to carry that unfair suspicion entirely alone for these past 3 years, after he was no longer here to help you carry it together. Wren wrote to her own father that winter, describing the culvert and the whole strange sequence of events that had led a routine storm shelter to become, in the end, exactly the kind of steady purpose she'd feared she might never find again after the contracting decision ended her own drainage career. His reply came a few weeks later, brief but proud in the particular way Wren remembered him always being. Told you a good drainage technician's eye for the difference between original work and later modification would find use somewhere, whatever the county decided about needing it anymore. Proud of you for checking those records properly when a dead man's whole reputation depended on somebody finally looking closely enough. So here's the question worth sitting with tonight. How many people carry an unfair suspicion to their own graves, certain of the truth but never able to prove it, waiting decades for exactly the evidence that finally exists but has simply never been found? And what does it take? A storm forcing a stranger through the wrong culvert, a hidden chamber built into infrastructure nobody thought to question, an investigation finally reopened after 30 years, for a dead man's name to finally be cleared. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to Ember and Rail, because there's always room by the fire for one more, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from tonight.